Welcome, everyone. We're going to wait just another minute or two to make sure everyone gets in. So just be patient. We'll start in just a moment. Thank you. Okay, good. Okay. 7:05. Good. Good evening, everyone. This is Valley Beth Shalom, College of Jewish Studies, where we offer university-level Jewish learning without the quizzes, no football team, no sororities, no fraternity parties, just good learning. So welcome. We're delighted you're all here and hope that everyone's taking very, very good care during these very strange and interesting times. So welcome. Good to have you here. The plan is to go through the middle of May with these Wednesday nights. We'll be on Wednesday nights from now on. We had a couple nights on Tuesdays because we had holidays this week, but these past weeks, but we'll be on Wednesday nights through probably close to the end of May. And if you all stick around, we'll keep doing it. If you all have better television to watch, then let's do something else. But it's wonderful to have you together. So thank you for coming on. And I'll do my very best to break a couple of times during the course of the talk to answer some questions. But as you all know, I have the teaching style of Benito Mussolini. So forgive me for that. It's an old bad habit. So we're talking about the great questions, the questions that animate religious life, the questions that animate human life, the questions that reflective people ask. And I called the series The Questions That Won't Go Away. In the last weeks, we've talked about the functions of religion. We've talked about Israel. We've talked about the Holocaust. And tonight, what I'd like to do is take up the question, which I think in many ways is the most powerful question that won't go away. And that has to do with when we find ourselves in a circumstance when life is just unfair, when life is unjust, when we ask ourselves, why me? Now, let's begin at the very beginning. At the very beginning, the Bible opens with the words, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. The earth was unformed and void, tohu vavohu, mishmash. And the Ruach, the Spirit of God, hovered over the waters. And God said, let there be light, and there was light. And God separated the light from the darkness, called the light day and the darkness night. And God saw that it was good, and it was evening and morning, a first day. It's significant that the Bible begins with the creation of the world, because in a very real way, that's what religion is all about. It's about creating a world for us. Religion is about giving us a world that we can live in, a world that is orderly, predictable, in some sense controllable. It's not just a booming mass of chaos. If the world were simply chaos, we would go insane. But the fact that we know that the world has certain patterns and we can predict what those patterns are, and we can live in that world and count on those patterns to persist, gives us the ability to have a meaningful life in the world. This is what the philosopher or the sociologist Peter Berger called world maintenance. Culture teaches us how to navigate our world, and religion helps keep that culture strong. I suggested in one of our earlier sessions that religion is like a map. It's like the map of the mall when you go looking for a particular shop. You walk into this huge shopping mall and there's hundreds of stores all over, and you would take hours and hours looking for one particular shop. But you walk up to this there's a display, a stanchion there, and there's a map, and it tells you how to get to the shop you're looking for. First, it's the layout of the mall, And then there's an all-important big orange spot that says you are here. And that orients you so that you can figure out if I'm trying to find Macy's or Nordstrom's or whatever I'm looking for. I go this way, I make 2 right turns, and that's where it's supposed to be. Well, religion does the same thing. Here is the way the world is laid out. Here are the elements in our world. And here's how you find the things that you want. In fact, it goes one step further. What religion does is tell you what you want. If you want happiness, satisfaction, a sense of contentment, here's what you got to go and do. And here's how you find it. And here is the assurance that you're going to find it where we tell you you're going to find it. That's what the map of religion does for all of us. It's what the map of culture does for all of us. But what happens when we follow the map and we still get lost? What happens when things happen to us that make us say, now, wait a minute, it was supposed to be here and it's not here? What happens when things happen to us and make us say, what is going on here? This isn't right. The psychologists call those moments loss, L-O-S-S. The philosophers call those same moments evil, E-V-I-L. Now, loss and evil are being used in that sense in a technical sense. It's not the general sense of them. And what they mean is an experience that make us feel like we're not at home in our world, that our world is not controllable, that we can't find what we're looking for on the map, or what we're looking for isn't there. What happens when the world seems to stop feeling like it's home, stop feeling like it's our place, stop feeling like it welcomes us? What happens when we have an event in our lives and we stop and we ask, why me? Why me? Why did this happen to me? Now, I want to say 2 things about this. Number one, that moments of loss, experience of loss, are subjective. There are people who go through some pretty horrendous experiences and are able to sort of brush it off and keep going on with life, and it doesn't affect them. And then there are people who go through experiences that many of us might look at them and say, that's rather trivial, and yet they lose it. They just go berserk. They go nuts. Because how you experience loss is entirely subjective. That is, it's in you or in me. Some of us are more resilient and some of us are more sensitive. Some of us have had previous experiences of loss, which make the current experience of loss compounded, makes the current experience of loss even more difficult. And some of us have an inner strength that enables us to experience what anybody else would see as a terribly painful circumstance, and yet we endure it without much difficulty. It's entirely subjective. You can't say to somebody, get over it. In fact, if you're the one who's suffering and someone says to you, get over it, it's kind of insulting, you know? It's kind of difficult. That's the first thing I want to say about loss. And the second thing I want to say about loss is all of us will experience loss. All of us will experience evil. All of us will have a moment of saying, why me, in our lives. It is inevitable. It is absolutely inevitable. Why is that? Well, because being a human being is based on a paradox. It's a contradiction. And here's the fundamental contradiction of being human. We are a soul encased in a body. And by the word soul, I don't mean anything mysterious or metaphysical. I just mean self. We are a self that's carried around in the world in a body. But self or soul and body are made out of very different things. Self or soul is precious, infinitely precious. Self or soul is unique. It's completely unique. There's no 2 of us who are the same. Self and soul is remarkable. It's miraculous. The body, however, is made out of stuff. It's pretty ordinary. And frankly, it's pretty fragile. I mean, it's pretty fragile. And here is the great paradox of being a human being. You have something as precious, unique, and special as the self or the soul carried around in a container that's very, very ordinary and very fragile. The body is made out of stuff, and all stuff breaks. All stuff breaks is the second law of thermodynamics of the great sage Rabbi Isaac Newton. It's the law of entropy. All higher order systems break down into lower order systems. So a thing that's as complicated as your body and my body is inevitably going to break down. And all of us, I think, have had the experience of losing a loved one or losing a friend to a disease or to an accident or to death, and saying, how could such a beautiful soul be taken from us in such a horribly ordinary and prosaic and silly way? How could such a beautiful soul have been carried around in a container that's this fragile? Dear God, you must have made a mistake. You meant to put us in something much more durable. You meant to put us in something much more permanent, but we're not. While our souls, our self might be permanent, our bodies are very temporary, very temporary. And that's the great paradox of being a human being. And so all of us are subject to disease. All of us are subject to accident. All of us are subject to the things that happen in the world. And all of us one day will leave this world, will die. That's the inevitable condition of being a human being. And that's, and that is the great paradox of being a human being. But now the upshot of that, the conclusion from that is that all of us will know moments of loss in our lives. We'll know moments of loss when our loved ones leave us. We'll know moments of loss when we lose our health and have to struggle. We'll know moments of loss when we're in pain. We'll know moments of loss when things that are precious to us are taken away. That's the inevitable condition of being a human being. And that means that sometime or another, all of us are going to turn to something. Many of us turn to religion and say, why me? Why did this happen to me? Why is this happening? And that's the question that you ask when you experience loss, because Rabbi Schulweis pointed this out many years ago. The question, why me, isn't really a question for a reason. We're not really looking for a reason. It's a way of saying, woe is me. I'm in pain. I'm hurting. I need some strength. I need resilience. I need some support. And all of us will inevitably ask that question. Now, different religious traditions have many different ways of addressing this moment. And what I'd like to do tonight is to take a look at some of the ways that the Jewish tradition has addressed this moment. But I want to put a little warning label on session tonight. Like we can talk, next time we'll talk about, the Torah, and is the Torah true? And after that, we'll talk about prayer. And before we talked about Israel. These are wonderful theological questions, but I don't think I'm going to make anybody cry by giving you a particular theology of why the Torah is true. But tonight, we might all have to have a cry, because in order to really understand this, you sort of have to put yourself in that position. And I know that all of us have been there. All of us have been there. And I want to sort of apologize at the beginning, or at least have a trigger warning that we're going to talk about some sad things today. And if we talk about some sad things and you're feeling emotional, that's good. It means you have a heart. It means you're human. It means you have a soul. So just be aware of that. So what happens when bad things happen to good people? Now, the whole notion of bad things happening to good people is itself a very interesting sort of circumstance. It's a very interesting circumstance. It's based on a theology. It's based on an idea. So let's take a look in the sources at that idea. Okay, let's take a look and see what we can do with that idea. I want to learn a source with you today. That's a remarkable source. It's this Talmud in Talmud Kiddushin 39. It's actually 39b. So this is the Talmud. Of course, the Talmud is the great compendium of Jewish wisdom of the 3rd through 5th century. And in Talmud Kiddushin, they're talking about a Mishnah, a particular ruling, which says that whenever we do a mitzvah, God rewards us. And whenever we do an avera, we do a sin, God punishes us. So the universe in which these rabbis are living is a universe with a living God. And that universe of a living God, that God functions as a divine parent. We all grew up with parents, and if we were lucky to grow up with loving parents, our parents rewarded us when we were good and punished us when we were bad. And so it's not unusual for human beings to grow up and project that into the universe and say, that's the ideal universe. The ideal universe, which is home, just like the home I grew up in, is inhabited by a God, Avinu Shebashamayim, a Father who are in heaven. And that God rewards us when we're good and punishes us when we're evil. So if we're living well, it must be because we earned it through our mitzvot. And if we're suffering, it must be because we have earned that suffering. So the rabbis of the Talmud have a wonderful way. Once you put forth a premise like that one, they're right away going to go to town and try to understand it. And they're going to present a case. They're going to present a circumstance which challenges this. And here's the circumstance. The father said to his son, go up to the loft and bring me the young birds from the nest there. The boy went up, and before he took the baby birds, he shooed away the mother bird. Now, the Talmud is quick to point out that in doing this thing, this boy fulfilled two important mitzvot of the Torah. Number one, he honored his father. And number two, he shooed away the mother bird before taking the fledglings, which is a law in the Book of Deuteronomy. And what makes these two laws unique is that they're the only two laws in the entire Torah in which the reward for doing that mitzvah is given to you in the text of the Torah right after the commandment. And guess what? The reward for both of them is the same. You will live a long life. You will live a good and long life. So this boy climbs up to the loft of the barn, and he observes his father's commandment, shoos away the mother bird, takes the fledglings, observing the Torah's commandment, and on the way down from the loft, the boy fell and he died. And the Talmud asks, what happened to the reward of good and long life? Where's the reward? What kind of world is this? How could this possibly have happened? The Torah assures us that if you observe these commandments, you will live a long, long life. This was just a boy. How could he have fallen and died? Now remember, what's the premise? What's the premise of the question? Well, the premise of the question is that there's a God who inhabits the universe, and God rewards and punishes, and that everything that happens in the world is according to God's will. Let's take a look at a source which teaches that. So I'm going to go backwards here a little bit. I'm going to go backwards on my worksheet, but I want to go backwards right here into the Torah. So let's go back to Genesis 45. Now, this is the end of the story of Joseph and his brothers. You remember the story of Joseph and his brothers, that Joseph was the younger brother, is the second youngest of the 12 sons of Jacob. And he's had these dreams, these very egocentric dreams, where he dreamed that the whole world was bowing down to me. And he wore this coat of many colors, and his brothers just hated him. And one day when the father sent Joseph to his brothers, the brothers decided to kidnap him and kill him. And before they could kill him, they had this better idea: we'll sell him into slavery. And so they sold him into Egyptian slavery. And by hook and by crook, literally, he ends up as the prime minister of Egypt, the most powerful man in the world. His brothers come down to get food because they're starving. And at a certain point in the story, Joseph decides it's time to reveal himself to his brothers. Chapter 45 in the book of Genesis, Joseph said to his brothers, Ani Yosef achicha. I am Joseph, your brother. Od avichai. Is my father still alive? And the brothers couldn't answer. They were dumbfounded. And he said, come forward to me. And when they came forward, he said, I am your brother Joseph, he whom you sold into Egypt. That's called an uh-oh moment, right? Now, do not be distressed or reproach yourselves because you sold me here. It was to save life that God sent me ahead of you. It is now 2 years. There's been famine in the land, and there's still 5 years to come in which there'll be no yield from the tilling. God has sent me ahead of you to ensure survival, your survival on earth, and to save your lives in an extraordinary deliverance. It was not you who sent me here, but God. And he has made me father to Pharaoh, lord of his household, and ruler over Egypt. So what's the point of this? The Bible's trying to say, at least in this story, that everything that happens to us in life is part of a larger plan with a capital P, the larger plan. Now, that's a very comforting idea. It certainly comforted Joseph when he figured out why he was stuck in Egypt. And for many of us, when bad stuff happens to us, it would be wonderful to be able to say, I believe that everything that happens to me is part of a bigger plan. I don't know how many of you have ever been to funerals where you've heard a rabbi or a minister or a priest or a preacher say, we don't know why this happened, but we have to trust that everything is in God's hands. And for some people, that is a very comforting philosophy. That's a very comforting philosophy. And the Torah goes on a little bit later to sort of give us what the plan is. In the book of Deuteronomy, we have the plan. It tells us what the terms are. It's the second paragraph we recite after the Shema. If you obey the commandments that I give you today, loving the Lord your God and serving him, I'll grant you rain. And if you turn away and worship other gods, I'll take away the rain and you'll starve. So what's the plan? It's reward and punishment. Virtue brings reward. Virtue brings reward. And sin brings punishment. And therefore, if you're suffering, it must be because you sinned. It must be because you deserved it. And that's a very simple way of looking at the world. Now, there's only one little problem with that. It doesn't work. And the Bible begins to question this, even in the Bible itself. In fact, there's an entire book of the Bible which says, don't buy it. And that's the book of Job. The book of Job is about a righteous man who suffers terribly. And he says, why, God? Why did you make me suffer? I don't deserve this. And then he has these friends. With friends like these, you don't need friends who show up and they say, well, you must have deserved it. This is what happens to you. And Job says, no, I didn't do anything that's this evil. How could this possibly say something I deserve? Now, it's so interesting that the Bible itself, we like to think of the Bible as a book of strict religion, of traditional religion. And yet the Bible itself attacks this idea because it's not empirically supported. It's not empirically supported. In other words, you can't see that in the world itself. And besides, psychologically, it's one thing if I say that about myself, okay? If I'm the one who's suffering and I want to say about myself, I believe that there's a plan and somehow this has been sent to teach me something, or somehow this has been sent to help me, or somehow this has been sent to give me a different perspective on life. That's one thing. But if somebody tells it to me, that's a really hard thing to hear. I've been a cancer patient in my life. Thank God I'm very, very healthy now. But I've given a lot of time to visiting cancer support groups. And I have a little game that I play with my friends, other cancer patients. I'm going to write a book. It's called The 100 Dumbest Things People Tell You When You Have Cancer. Tell me what I should put in the book. Every hand goes up. Somebody says, somebody came to me and said, oh, you have that kind of cancer? My uncle died of that. Not helpful. And somebody else comes and says, oh, and they told me this. People literally told me, they said, you're going to be a much better rabbi if you survive this. Like, thank you very much. I'll go to professional training. Can I get out of it? I mean, it's one thing if you say this about yourself. It's one thing to find meaning in your own suffering and to say, I recognize that I can learn something from this. That's very legitimate. But for someone to tell you, stop crying, this is really good, it's part of God's plan, that's very hard to hear. That's very hard to hear. And more than that, which is what the book of Job points out, what you're ultimately saying to the person is, you deserve it. You deserved it. I told some of you a story that I cherish. There's a true story. There's a member of our community that had a cousin who had a child who was very ill. And the child had a form of cancer. And because they knew I had some experience, they asked if I would see the cousin, the mother of the kid. So she comes to my office and she's sitting in the waiting room. And I go out to greet her. And I say, hi, I'm Rabbi Feinstein. I'm so sorry to hear about your daughter. I'm so glad we could talk. This lady points a finger at me. Now, in rabbi school, they taught us that when they point a finger, it's never good. She points a finger at me and she says, listen, Rabbi, don't give me any of your, and excuse the language, your religion crap. I don't believe in this religion stuff. I gave it up when I was a kid. I was raised Orthodox, but I gave it up when I was 8 or 9 years old. It's all a bunch of crap. It means nothing. Don't tell me I should pray, and don't tell me I should be religious, and don't tell me to believe in God. I don't believe in any of this crap. I say, okay, would you like to come in and talk? She said, okay. So she comes in my office and she sits down, and I sit down opposite her, and before I can say a word, she says, don't tell me about God or prayer, and certainly don't ask me for money. I'm not giving you anything. This is all a bunch of hocus pocus, all a bunch of crap. I don't believe in any of this stuff. I don't believe in God. I believed in God when I was a little girl, but that's for infants. That's for children. I don't believe. I said, okay. She said, I only have one question for you. I said, yeah, what's your question? Why is God doing this to me? Now think of that for a minute. It took me aback. Why is God doing this to me? I don't believe in God, and I don't believe in religion, and I don't believe in prayer, and I don't believe in you, Rabbi, but I want to know why God is doing this to me. Now, what happened there? Let's analyze this a moment, shall we? This is a mother whose child is very ill. She is suffering as much as anybody in the world can suffer. There's no greater suffering than when your child is ill. It's even worse than when you suffer. So she's suffering more than anyone can suffer. And then she can't find any meaning to it. You see, the reason why people believe that there's a plan, that God has a plan in the world, is because we human beings are allergic to randomness. We're allergic to chaos. She's trying to figure out what's the order, what's the plan, what are the rules of the universe, what's the map? And she doesn't have it because she doesn't have religion in her life. But you know what happens? You ever, God forbid, drop your computer or drop your cell phone or drop an iPad? You know what happens to it? All the settings in the computer go back to the ones that were set at the factory. It's called default settings. Because this poor woman is suffering the worst thing that a person can suffer, a mother can suffer, she's reverted. She has no theology. She has no way to understand this. She has no map. So she reverts back to the last theology, the last set of beliefs that she knew, which was the one she had when she was 8. And when she was 8, she believed that mommy and daddy were protecting me and would take care of me and reward me if I'm good and punish me if I'm bad. And that must be what God is doing to me. But the upshot of that, of course, the conclusion of that is the reason why your kid is suffering is because you did something. That's why she said, why is God doing this to me? She said. She believes that she must have committed some sin, and this God in heaven that she doesn't believe in is punishing her. In other words, what that idea has done is double her suffering. But as they say on television, but wait, there's more. Not only has it doubled her suffering, but because she has no religious life, she doesn't know how to expiate the sin. She doesn't even have a language for describing this. So it triples her suffering. And she sits in front of me as a broken soul, telling me that she believes that the God she doesn't believe in is destroying her child and destroying her. And she begins to tell me, I've done a lot of good things in my life, Rabbi. And she what? Extraordinarily good things. Extraordinarily kind and generous person. And she wants to know why a person who's so generous and so kind and has given so much of herself is suffering. That's not the way the world is supposed to work. What do you do for such a person? So I said to her, I'm a cancer patient. And she's got shocked. She said, you? Meaning what? Meaning like, you're on his team. Like, you're in the business. Like, you're an insider. How can you be suffering? I said, yeah, I had cancer twice. Terrible chemotherapy. How can you be suffering? I said, because I don't believe that God gave me cancer. Well, then how did you get it? I believe he got it the old-fashioned way. My mother gave it to me. I had bad genetics on my mother's side. And you know what? When you have a genetic precondition or predisposition to certain cancers and certain environmental factors touch you, we end up with cancer. I was terribly, terribly lucky. I found doctors who can help me. Let's pray that your daughter finds doctors who can help you and help her. It's not God who made her sick. It's her genetics, and the doctors are going to work really hard to make her better. And then the most remarkable thing happened. This very angry woman starts to cry, and she says to me, she's such a wonderful child, and I'm so scared. Now I can help her. So now I give her a hug, and I say, tell me about your daughter. Tell me about her. And we talk about the kid, and we talk about how we can help her. And I said, who's taking care of her? And we started to think about the people that have brought her some hope. You see, this theology of reward and punishment is built into us. I imagine all of us have this feeling, right? All of us feel sometimes that bad stuff happens to us because we deserve it. It's built. I don't know if any of us can get rid of it completely. And yet, it's so dangerous. Because it makes us, it loads us up with guilt when we don't need to have guilt, and it prevents us from growing in certain ways that we need to be growing. And that's the first answer. So let's go back to the source. So let's go back to the source in Kiddushin. So here the rabbis are going to ask a question about this. I gave you a little bit of Job here to look at. The boy falls and dies, and the rabbis of the Talmud say, well, where is his reward of a good and long life? So the rabbis are in trouble because they want to defend their idea that there's a God who controls everything in the universe, and everything is controlled by good and evil, by reward and punishment. So the first thing they say is, well, maybe it didn't happen. It's just a story. No, Rabbi Jacob was there. He saw it happen. And now they're getting worried. Now they're really panicking. This is Rabbinic Panic. Can you read it? Maybe the boy was thinking sinful thoughts. In other words, the reason he fell was because he was really a bad boy. He was a bad boy. And even though he was in the process of doing 2 mitzvahs, obeying his father and shooing away the mother bird, inside he was an idolater. He was a gross religious criminal, a spiritual outlaw who deserved what happened to him. But the rabbis say, no, can't be. Because number one, God doesn't punish us for sinful thoughts, right? Sinful thoughts don't get you punished in Jewish life. Maybe, they say maybe, and this is really panicking, maybe he was thinking about idols. He was planning. And as soon as he was finished with his old father, he was going to run out and sacrifice to some Moloch, to some idol god. And that's why God killed him. And the rabbi said, no, it couldn't be. Because not only are you not punished for sinful thoughts, you're not punished for acts you haven't committed yet, but there's a bigger principle involved. Anybody here ever gone to Israel and had friends come to you and hand you some money for tzedakah? Anyone ever have that experience? You're going to Israel and someone gives you $5 and says, give it to tzedakah. And the word they use is shaliach. Now, why is that? Because there's a fundamental principle in the Talmud that says, a shaliach mitzvah cannot be harmed. If you are a shaliach, if you are a messenger, if you are my appointed proxy for the performance of a mitzvah, nothing bad can happen to you in the process. So if I give you $5 and you are my shaliach mitzvah, you'll go to Israel and you give it to tzedakah, of course. You get to Israel safely and you'll get home. That's my wish. So here's the same principle. Even if he was a bad boy, planning on worshiping some idol, the fact that he was in the process of doing mitzvot, of observing, of respecting his father, and of shooing away the mother bird, that should have protected him. That should have protected him. So how could it be? How could it be that a young person engaged in doing the 2 mitzvahs of the Torah that enable you, that promise a long and good life, falls and dies in the process? How could it be? And in the last line of this section of the Talmud, they abandon the premise, which is kind of radical when you think about it, right? They abandoned the premise and they said it was a broken ladder. Now stop and think about that for a minute. It was a broken ladder. and you can't depend on God to fix a broken ladder. I remember when the Challenger, what was it? The Challenger, was that the spacecraft that blew up? Remember when that happened?
Yeah.
Yeah. So the Challenger blew up, and I remember reading all of these sermons from rabbis around that and preachers from around the country talking about, why this might have happened and how come God didn't protect these people. And then, wait a minute. You put a bunch of people in an aluminum can and hurtle them through the atmosphere at 3,200 miles an hour, and you wonder what. I mean, so what does it mean to say a broken ladder? What does that mean to say a broken ladder? It means God does not control everything that happens in the universe. There are things in the universe which are governed by the laws of nature. The laws of gravity work all the time. And even if you're a good kid doing a mitzvah, that doesn't give you an exemption, doesn't give you a get out of jail free card against the laws of gravity. You climb up the ladder breaks, you're going to fall down. God's not going to catch you. Which means what? Which means what should have happened? That the Father should have checked the ladder. That we do believe in providence. We do believe that God watches out for us. How so? God has given us intelligence. And intelligence enables us to do risk assessment. And risk assessment means we have to take care of ourselves. We have to take care of ourselves. And so you end up in a very interesting sort of naturalistic religious life if you take seriously that last line. But you can see how the rabbis are struggling with this. Now, the other answer is an answer which you'll find in the Talmud, by the way, at this section, which is to say, I believe in another world, Olam Haba, which means I do believe in a plan. And I do believe in reward and punishment for our sins and for our merits. But I don't believe that reward and punishment is here. It's not visible. It's not in front of us. It only happens in another world. And that's another comforting idea to people. That's a different comforting idea. So if we put all of this together, here's what we get. Here's what we get. I want you to imagine 3 propositions that I would write on a blackboard. You ready? You ready? Proposition number 1 says, God is all powerful. And proposition number 2 is, God is all good. And proposition number 3 is, evil exists. That is, bad things happen to good people. These 3 propositions are incongruent. You can't have all 3 of them. And the way that a religious tradition attacks this problem is by crossing one of them off. So the first one we could cross off is the bottom one. I believe in a God who's good, and I believe in a God who's powerful, and therefore anything that happens to me is God's will. It has to be part of God's plan. And I believe that there's reward and punishment, but it doesn't happen in this world. It happens in another world because I can't see it in this world. It has to happen in another world. And that's how I go on believing in a God who's just and loving and a God who's all powerful. And when I see bad things happen to good people, I am sure that those people will be that a recompense will be made in another world. That's one way of answering the question. And I'm sure that you've all heard that answer before. A second way to answer the question is to put the 3 propositions back on the board and keep the third one on, but cross out the second one. I believe a God who's powerful, and I believe that bad things happen to good people, because sometimes God doesn't do what's good. Because sometimes God gets out of control, because sometimes God has other things, or at least what God calls good, we can't call good. I think you've probably heard this, and ministers and rabbis and priests say this as well, where they'll say, we can't question God. We don't know God's wisdom. What's good for God may not be good for us. Personally, I find that a very troubling theology, but you've heard it sometimes. That's the end of the book of Job, by the way. At the end of the book of Job, when Job has spent 35 chapters asking God, why me? God shows up at the end of the book and he says, you know what? Shut up. I do what I want. You don't have a right to question me. And Job says, okay, all right, fine, you win. Which is a very sad thing, because you'd want him to press the case that I want justice in the world. But Job gives in. which is to say that sometimes acceptance of what is all we can do. That challenging doesn't get us anywhere. And the third possibility, the third answer, is an answer that we find in the sources of the tradition, although it's not the majority opinion, but it was made very popular by Rabbi Kushner in his famous book, When Bad Things Happen to Good People. Harold Kushner was a conservative rabbi, he is, thank God he's still alive, a conservative rabbi living in Natick, Massachusetts, who lost a child. And that's as horrible a thing as anyone could experience ever. And he lost the child to a terrible degenerative disease. And he spent a year in a deep, deep, horrible depression. And when he came out of it, he taught this idea. If you take the three propositions, evil exists, that is, bad things do happen to us. And God is good, but God isn't all powerful. That there are certain aspects of reality in which God has let go and lets the world take its natural course, lets the world do what it's going to do. And in those cases, we can shake our fists, but it's not God who caused this to happen. It was caused by natural things happening. It was caused by natural causes. And therefore, the only providence that exists in the world in those circumstances is to be able to use what we know about the world, to use our intelligence, to use our ingenuity, to gain control over that part of the world which is still random and chaotic, and cure the disease, and learn diagnostic techniques, and to perform mitzvot in the world which might make the world more gentle. But it isn't God who took your loved one. It was just disease. It was nature, and nature doesn't have a conscience. Nature doesn't care who's good and who's evil. It was a rickety ladder. And when there's a rickety ladder, you don't blame God for what happened to us. And those are the kinds of answers. Now, none of those answers work. I'm going to say that out loud. None of those answers is foolproof, safe deposit box, secure, and say, oh, now I know why bad things happen to good people. I can sleep tonight. And they don't work. And I'll tell you why they don't work. Because what we said at the very beginning, to be human is to be subject to the fragility of the human condition. And the fragility of the human condition is going to make us cry. And there's no answer that I can give you, which is going to say, oh, that's going to make it better. The only answer that I can tell you that's going to make it better is I can say to you, every one of us is going to suffer at some point in our lives, and some of us are going to suffer terribly. But you don't have to suffer alone. That we can be with you, that we can join with you, that we can hold your hand, that we can come and share with you, that we can help you learn and help you heal how to live in this crazy world. And that's really the only answer that the Jewish tradition has come up with. That, plus the imperative to heal disease, to bring peace, to help one another, and to do everything that's in our power to bring tikkun, to help to give ourselves strength and to bring gentleness where there is cruelty in the world. Those are the basic Jewish answers to this basic problem. And so this is a question which is going to go unanswered because it is built into the human condition. And no matter how clever a theology might be, it's never going to be able to answer the question in a way that's going to make it all better. Once you grow up and become a grown-up, and too many people have to become grown-ups too soon, and confront that this is what being a human being is about, then you learn how to build your own resilience in the world. And for this, I want to suggest that the answer is not any particular line of theology or line of philosophy or ritual form or poem to read. For this, that's what a whole religious life is about. It's about building a community that will stand with us in moments of sadness, just like in moments of joy. It's by building a life that matters. So when I do feel like I am broken, I can at least remember that there were moments of significance when I know that I made a difference in the world. It's by building a community that's dedicated, if not changing the human condition at its root, at least making the world a little more gentle, a little more humane, a little closer to what it should have been from the very beginning. Maybe easing the pain of the next person, if not easing the pain of this one. And that's what we Jews do in the course of building an entire religious life. It's nothing that you can adopt at the cemetery standing under the grave, but it's something that you bring to an entire lifetime. You bring an entire lifetime of living in that way. That gives us a sense of resilience. So let me stop here. That was an awful lot to lay on you for 45 minutes on a Wednesday night. I'm delighted to entertain questions and comments and counter sermons. If you just wave your hand wildly, I'll call upon you, and then we can hear one another and we can share. And I have a little more to say, and I'll add a little bit more in just a moment, but I want to just take a quick break. So Douglas, you want to go ahead, unmute?
Yes, I think I'm unmuted, am I? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
The story you read from Talmud Kiddushin, isn't that story also told in the Jerusalem Talmud, where we're introduced to the character of Elisha ben Abuya?
Something like it, yeah. Elisha ben Abuya was one of the great students of the early rabbis, and he witnessed a child's death. And he looked at this and he said, late din v'late dayan. There is no judge and there is no judgment. And according to the tradition, he became the great quintessential rebel of the rabbinic tradition. He gave up his belief and became either an atheist or an agnostic and became a Greek philosopher. If you've ever read Milton Steinberg's wonderful book, As a Driven Leaf, it's about Elisha ben Abuya. It's a wonderful book, by the way, and a really interesting picture of the rabbinic period. And that's exactly right. That's the story. He saw that and he said, I can't believe that there's any God in the world. His colleagues said this one, and this is the story that was included in the Babylonian Talmud, which is, it's a rickety ladder. And we have to recognize that when nature is involved, when it's a natural phenomenon, you're not asking for a moral cause anymore. You're dealing with something called an accident. And accidents occur in the world. It's not that God caused it. That's how the world works. That's how the world works. But it really is a shifting in the paradigm of whether I can accept the fact that there are things beyond God's control. You're exactly right. Thank you. Good. Any other questions, comments, counter sermons? Yes, Stanley, please.
I agree with, of course, everything that you said and what we can do in the Jewish tradition. Would you say that that's really so substantially different from any other religion that could come up with the same, the same community, the same ways of acting? Not that I'm going to change, but
yeah, absolutely. Read Buddhists. I happen to really have a deep respect for the Buddhist tradition. Buddhism, in a certain way, Buddhism is a very, very deep and sophisticated and complex religious tradition, a lot like Judaism. So there are many different voices within the Buddhist tradition, but one of the voices that is one of the principal voices in the Buddhist tradition says, the world as we know it is a world of impermanence. Everything is always changing. Everything is always changing. The great Buddhist image is the lover who gives the lover flowers. I give my wife flowers, right? I give my wife flowers and she loves the flowers and they're fragrant and they're fresh and they're beautiful and they're colorful. What happens after a couple of days?
They die.
The flowers are dead. The flowers dry up. The flowers become awful. And what happens to her happiness? Her happiness goes away. And so the Buddhist says, when you live in a world of impermanence where everything is always changing, if you attach yourself to anything, you're going to be hurt. So the Buddhist answer is, don't attach yourself to anything. Don't get attached. Don't get attached, because if you get attached, you're only going to be hurt. And so the Buddhist is like these four basic truths to the Buddhist tradition. And the first one is the world is a world of suffering, and it's downhill from there because of this notion of impermanence. And so the Buddhist tradition says, I'm going to withdraw. I'm going to disengage from the world and not attach myself and not attach my happiness to that which is always changing. Now, the Jewish tradition goes the opposite. The Jewish tradition starts with the idea that the world is, as we experience it, is broken. Now think about that for a minute. If something is broken, it was once whole, or rather latent within its brokenness is the possibility of wholeness. That is, all the pieces are there. And if something, we call it broken, that implies that it might be fixed. And the Jewish idea is that the world is not inevitably a world of suffering. It's just the way it's constructed right now is a world of suffering, but we can fix it. And even if we can't fix the whole thing, we can fix enough of it to make it significantly different than it was before. I don't know how many of you are vaccinated. I'm vaccinated. This was an amazing experience. I happened to go up to Henson Dam. I waited in line. This wonderful, wonderful young woman who worked for the fire department came by and said, "Is this your name?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Are you allergic to anything?" I said, "No." She said, "Great." Wham, gave me a shot. I said a bracha. Can you imagine this? Can you imagine this? How long did it take Dr. Salk and Dr. Sabin to find the vaccine for polio? It took them years and years of research. It took them 1 year to come up with the COVID vaccine. And now they're saying that now that they figured out the COVID vaccine, they're going to come up with a new vaccine now, which will vaccinate us against all coronaviruses, which means the common cold will go away. I can't wait for this. This is a machaya. I mean, so the Jewish tradition is not to disengage. The Jewish tradition is to engage, to fight against the brokenness of the world. Now, here's the difference. If you're a Buddhist, you can have tranquility. If you're a Buddhist, you can have serenity. Jews don't have serenity. If you have serenity, you're in the wrong shul, right? I mean, I have friends who've come to VBS and they say, "God, it's noisy here." like what? I say, "Yeah, that's what we are. We're not a serene people." I don't know if you knew this, Stanley, but we're not a serene people. I don't even know what the word serenity is in Hebrew. I don't think it was a word. Because we're engaged in the process of wrestling with the broken world. That's what we do. That's what we do. So if you want serenity, you have to disengage. Right? But if you want to change the world, you got to engage. And if you engage, you're going to be nervous like we are. Right? You're going to be a hilaria like we are, right? You're going to get involved. And this is a completely different sort of notion of who and what we are. And I think that's a really interesting contrast. Now, there is, by the way, a deeply wonderful activist tradition among Buddhists. It's called the tradition of the Bodhisattva. Bodhisattva is what we'd call a Rebbe, right? A Bodhisattva is a righteous person who's achieved enlightenment, who comes down and teaches the rest of us what we need to do to have enlightenment. And that's an activist tradition. And then there's another tradition of Jewish people who became Buddhists, Jubus. And they're the most interesting people of all, because they're they've brought a lot of Jewish commitment to Tikkun Olam, to Buddhism. And it's a marvelous thing to see. But these are different ways of attacking the problem. How do I live in a world knowing that it's going to inevitably break my heart? Do I step back and say, I'm not going to engage? I'm not going to fall in love. I'm not going to embrace the world. Or do I engage the world and live with it and live with it? And this is a really wonderful question. Thank you, Stan. It's a wonderful question. Barb and Len, I see your hand is up. Please unmute.
So Rabbi, I'm going to share a personal story with you.
Yeah.
My older sister, Marlis Philippa, she was born in about 1938. And she developed something that was very common at that time called Willem's tumor.
Oui.
And without going into details, there are doctors that are probably listening to this who know they didn't really have a cure, and they tried using radiation and whatnot. And my mother, I was told, her response to that was they didn't know how to heal her. She didn't blame anybody. They didn't know how to heal her. Yeah. Here's the end. Here's the happy ending. Nobody dies of Willem's tumor anymore.
That's wonderful.
So what I want to share with you is that personally, I've spent much of the last year, Len and I both, talking about life, and have come up with a conclusion that there's the accident of birth, where we're born and when. When we're born makes a difference in terms of what is available to try to fix things that need to be fixed. And our choices. the choices we make. And when you think about it, that's pretty much it. And if we make good choices or bad choices, they can affect people in a horrible way, or they can make the world a better place. We have it within our ability.
Yeah.
To do that. And so
That's a classic Jewish idea.
Yeah, and it's powerful, and it took a long time to finally come to that point.
I appreciate that so much. So let me tell you two stories to finish, and then we'll conclude tonight because it's getting late and it's time to finish the day. So first story, you all remember the 1994 Northridge earthquake? Everybody remember that earthquake? Well, let me tell you something. That was a lie. It wasn't in Northridge. It was under my kitchen in Granada Hills. Nina and I and the kids, we lived in a house in what's called the Artist Streets in Granada Hills. And at 4:32 in the morning on January 14th, 1992, our house jumped 8 feet in the air. And when it came crashing down, Nina and I had a beautiful panoramic view of the North San Fernando Valley from where the back wall of the bedroom used to be. Because the chimney, remember how this happened? The chimney separated from the house. The house was built out of stucco and the chimney was built out of brick, and they vibrated at a different rate, it turns out. I learned this, and it smashed open the wall, and we could see Northridge and Porter Ranch and Simi Valley from our bed. Everything we owned in the world was broken. We had no gas, electric, or water. None. Zip. We were living like cavemen, cave people. And then in the mitten derinnen, as they say in French, the city of LA in their genius came by and they red tagged our house, which means we had 48 hours to leave. That's me, Nina, 3 small children, our dog, and our housekeeper. We all had to leave. So we packed like crazy people, put everything in storage that we couldn't carry, took everything we could carry, moved in with my parents for a few weeks, moved in with Nina's parents for a few weeks, moved in at a rental house for a few weeks, and started to figure out what we were going to do with our lives. We had insurance. And so 6 weeks after the earthquake, State Farm Insurance sends an adjuster. He makes an appointment to see us. He comes up to the house. Lovely, lovely fellow from Kansas City, right? Walking around our house. He's a civil engineer, so he takes hours and hours to do a big assessment of our house about how much damage there was, structural damage, walls, windows, everything was a mess. The pool was a mess. The backyard was a mess. And then he sits down with us and he says, okay, now we're going to do an inventory of the personal property that you lost. Let's go room by room. Let's begin in the kitchen. What was it in the kitchen that you lost? So we said 6 sets of dishes. He puts his pencil down. He says, oh, come on. You didn't lose 6 sets of dishes. Nobody owns 6 sets of dishes. I said, of course we do. Milchik, Fleischik, Shabbos Fleischiks, Pesach Milchiks, Pesach Fleischiks, Shabbos Pesach Fleischiks. So he says, how y'all write Shabbos Pesach Fleischiks? So I give him the spelling, and he writes it into his little poem. He said, now, tell me something. Tell me, you're a rabbi? I said, yeah. I said, how come y'all have 6 sets of dishes? I said, because we're a very religious family. He puts his pencil. I said, ooh, my God. He says, you know, for a religious family, your house took a hell of a beating. You know, I thought the Lord was your shepherd or something like that. Now, what happened was, what was interesting is that we lived in Granada Hills. Next door lived a gentleman who was one of the largest producers of a certain form of pornography in all the world. Shall I say, Mr. Derriere? Let's just call it that, right? He was a lovely guy, by the way, but we knew what he did for a living, and sometimes he would have parties, and I would enjoy it. Anyway, so Mr. Derriere lived next door, and he lost, I'm not making this up, a teacup. A teacup. I lost everything I owned. So the guy from State Farm says, you know who lives next door? You know what I said, shut up. I don't want to know. Turns out that earthquakes have a sine wave. They go up and down. So my house got the brunt of it, and his house got nothing. So the rabbi lost everything he owned in the world and his house. Thank God nobody got hurt. And Mr. Derriere only lost a teacup. So the State Farm guy says, I thought the Lord was your shepherd or something. And I liked playing. And I said, yeah, he is. He sent me State Farm Insurance. He said, well, touche. And he wrote me a big check that afternoon. Now, a couple of weeks later, we have Hebrew school started at VBS, and Rabbi Schulweiss and I went in to talk to the kids. He said, Schulweiss didn't like kids. He said, you talk to him. So I started talking and I asked, anyone have any questions? And one of the kids raises his hand and says, did God send the earthquake? My dad said God sent the earthquake. Did God send the earthquake? Schulweiss pushed me aside. I want to answer this one. He said to the kid, you ever have a cold? The kid said, of course I had a cold. Did God give you the cold? He said, no, my sister gave me the cold. He said, did you ever have the flu? I said, of course I had the flu. Did God give you the flu? No. My brother gave me the flu. God doesn't send earthquakes. We live in the earth, and the earth has tectonic plates, and tectonic plates move. And that's the way the world works. And if you happen to live on a seam line between tectonic plates, well, your house falls down when the earth moves. That's that attitude of rickety ladder. So what do? We have to learn how to predict earthquakes. And we have to learn how to control and build so that earthquakes don't destroy our homes. But a wonderful thing happened. A wonderful thing happened about a week after we were packing up to leave and hadn't quite gotten out of the house yet. There was no water, electricity, or gas, and we were running out of supplies. And all of a sudden, this big yellow truck pulls up, and this guy gets out and he's selling bottles, cases of bottles of water. And there were people doing this and really gouging. If you went to the service station on the corner, they were selling them for like $25 a flat. And the guy was selling them for like, I think it was $6, $7, but it was the same thing as you could get them at Costco. And I said, that's the same as that costs at Costco. He said, yeah, that's where I got it from. I said, what are you doing? He said, well, my son and I, we live in another neighborhood. We live downtown, and we saw we didn't lose anything, and we saw what kind of trouble you folks were having. And I wanted to help. So I borrowed my brother-in-law's truck, went to Costco, bought all the water I could buy. I thought you folks might need some water. I said, that's amazing. He said, I just want to show my kid how I can help. I want to show my kid I can help. So when a catastrophe happens, one philosophy would say it's God's will. God was punishing in evil Granada Hills. And another philosophy might say we'll be rewarded in another world. And those are perfectly legitimate philosophies of life. But the philosophy that I have found comforting in my own existence and in my own life is to believe that sometimes these things happen because we're physical creatures in a physical universe. But the God who lives in the world with us lives in a yellow truck and comes around and delivers water just because it's the right thing to do. And if you're looking for God in a catastrophe, well, that's the place where you have to look for it. If you're looking for God in the catastrophe that we've just suffered, listen to the voice of Anthony Fauci. And remember that Anthony Fauci represents 1,000 scientists, technicians, and physicians who have put themselves forward to fight this disease and give us back the culture and the life that we had before, and even a better life, because that's what you do when you know that you are responsible for the world. Thank you for listening tonight. Thank you for being with me. Next week, we'll talk about the Torah and whether we can believe that the Torah is true. I'll tell you my stories of talking to Southern Baptists in Dallas, which are a lot of fun. And then we'll be talking about all the other questions that don't go away. So thanks for being with me tonight, and everybody take very, very good care. Stay well.
Thank you.
Have a good night.
Thank you.